Welcome to episode 3 of my Honda ST1100 Pan-European engine repairs. While I'm waiting for the brown big end shells to arrive, I thought I'd clean and strip the starter motor to make sure it's working just perfect. While I've got my ST1100 all stripped down, it's an ideal time to have a look at all the parts like the starter motor to make sure it's working properly. After all, it is 20 years old, although it hasn't been used very much, and it actually feels really nice. I'm going to take it apart and have a look inside just to make sure. The end caps and central portion of the motor have got raised marks for alignment. And the motor is held together with 2 long screws, so these are easily removed. With the 2 screws removed, I can pull off the end cap. Behind this cover should be the brushes, and this motor's got 4 sets of brushes. And there's quite a lot of residue carbon in the end cap as well, which we need to clean away. The carbon dust is produced as the brushes wear down with use. And here you can see the brushes, and they look in really nice condition, hardly worn at all, and it's all very clean. So I carefully remove the 2 shim washers and make a note of where they go, because it's important to put it back together as if it came apart. These ones are 2 steel washers. I can now pull off the front cover of the starter motor. It's a bit of a wiggle to get off, and there's a rubber O-ring seal as well, which we mustn't lose. Inside there's a thrust washer, a needle roller bearings and a rubber seal to keep the engine oil out of the starter motor. I removed the 2 front shims, one's made out of Bakelite and one's made out of steel. The field magnetic force of this motor is a permanent magnet, so the armature is stuck in hard. It takes a bit of effort to pull out. In fact, it's really strong with the magnet. I'm quite impressed, because sometimes the magnets are weak. And here's the rotating armature. It looks in really, really nice condition actually, I must say, but the commutator's a bit dirty, so we'll give that a clean up. But first, I'm going to make some little wire clips for holding the brushes back into their retainers to aid putting it back together. So I cut these pieces of wire into about 1-inch long lengths, and you can slide them down between the spring and the body to hold the brushes back, so that when you put the armature back in, it doesn't damage the brushes. With the 4 brushes secured in place, I can now concentrate on the armature, so I want to clean the commutator to make it nice and smooth. The commutator is basically a rotary switch used in some DC electric motors, and what it does, it takes electricity from the brushes and transfers it to windings inside the armature, causing it to magnetise and be attracted to the magnet in the outer casing. This causes the armature to rotate at high speed. With the armature mounted in a 3-jaw chuck on my lathe, I turn the lathe on and adjust the speed. With the speed set, I use a bit of fine abranet cloth to polish the commutator. This is barely worn at all, so it just needs a gentle polish. If the commutator had excessive wear, I'd just use the lathe tool to machine it back to a good surface, but in this case, a gentle rub with some fine abranet brings it back to a really smooth, shiny surface. With the commutator surface looking smooth and unblemished, I finish off with some very fine wet and dry paper, around 1200 grade. The last thing to do now is to scratch between the long grooves and remove any burrs and sharp edges that have come over from the edges of the commutator strips. I just use a piece of metal that's been ground down just slightly thinner than the gap, draw it backwards and forwards, and it makes a nice smooth line. And then I can finally polish with some 1200 wet and dry, and the job's done and it's ready for assembly. There we go, that looks just perfect. I'm really pleased with that. Before I can assemble the motor, I need to clean out all the carbon residue from the end casing, so I use a bit of degreaser in a tin. Well, that's the insides of the casing cleaned. Just need to get that white round with a piece of cloth now, and that looks just perfect. So now I'm going to use my rotary wire brush on my electric drill to clean the outer casing up. The rotary wire brush makes light work of cleaning up the outside casing. To be honest, it's not that bad really, but I just thought I'd give it a nice clean up while it's all in bits. I also clean up the central casing of the electric motor. This has been plated with some sort of zinc finish, but it's not bad condition, but it has some light oxide corrosion, and this soon removed it. And to finish off, I clean up the 2 screws. With all the parts cleaned, I can now start the reassembly. So the first thing I do is put a bit of oil on the drive side of the motor. Then I can replace the 2 shims and gently slide on the front cover, being careful not to damage the oil seal. And that rotates really nice, so I'm really pleased with that. So now I need to oil the oil-like bush to put the oil back in. Oil-like bushes are made out of porous material, usually sintered, so it's got gaps between the metal particles to allow oil to actually soak into the metal surface and stay contained. So I'll put in a few drips. Then the armature slides straight in and spins really freely. So that's just a check, so I've got to put the central casing on first. So next I refit the 2 thrust shims, sliding away with the armature axle, and put a little drop of oil on just to make sure. Then I'll replace the O-ring seal onto the armature body, making sure it sits nicely on its grooves to seal. Then the motor shaft armature slides straight in, and the magnet sucks it straight in really hard. You have to be careful. It came in so quick that the washers came straight off the end, so perhaps I should have fitted them afterwards. But anyway, they go back on easily. So now I can remove those little bits of wire that held the brushes retained safely in their housing. So now they can pop forward and hit the commutator. So that's all 4 pulled out. And then I can line up the marks on the outside of the front cover with the main body. And when I replace the end cover, there's a special little groove that lines up with the slot to make sure it's aligned correctly. It's really important this lines up. On the actual main body of the actual motor, there's a raised portion just there. And that lines up with these 2 grooves here in the actual end casing. This allows it all to fit properly with the main feed wire and the mounting points on the actual motor bike when it's put back together. So I just realign the front cover and I can put in the 2 screws and tighten them. I lubricate the threads first so the screws go in nice and easily, because sometimes they're a bit tight or they're a bit corroded. With the 2 screws tightened, I first check that the motor rotates freely, which it does, so now I can connect it up to a battery and see if it works. I connect up a wire for the positive feed, and the negative feed comes through the body of the motor. So to test the motor, I rest the body of the motor on the negative terminal of the battery and connect the red wire up to the positive terminal of the battery, and the motor spins into life and sounds just perfect. So that's the motor all cleaned, fully reconditioned and ready for use, so I can put that back on the floor, ready for assembly. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm really pleased that the starter motor is working just perfect, ready for when we get the engine back together for its first start. Oh, and don't forget, it's free to subscribe, and you won't miss any of my future videos.